Long before fashion, identity, or aesthetics existed as ideas, clothing emerged as a direct response to environmental pressure. For most of human evolutionary history, survival depended entirely on physical adaptation and behavior. Covering the body was not a cultural choice at first. It was a practical solution shaped by climate, movement, and biology. The earliest hominins appeared in East Africa around 6 to 7 million years ago. For millions of years after that, they lived without any form of artificial clothing. Their protection came from body hair, thick skin, and behavioral strategies such as seeking shelter, avoiding extreme exposure, and moving seasonally in response to climate changes. In warm and stable environments, clothing simply was not necessary. That began to change as the human body itself changed. One of the most important shifts in this story is the gradual loss of body hair. Fossil and comparative anatomical evidence suggests that members of the genus Homo, especially Homo erectus, experienced a significant reduction in body hair between roughly 1.2 million and 800,000 years ago. This change is closely linked to thermoregulation. A mostly hairless body, combined with a high density of sweat glands, made it possible to cool down efficiently during long walks and endurance running under intense heat. Before we dive in, drop your location in the comments and subscribe to Primal Roots if you're enjoying the journey. This adaptation gave humans a major advantage in open landscapes like the African savanna. It allowed longer hunting pursuits, greater mobility, and better survival during the hottest hours of the day. But this same adaptation created a new problem. A body optimized for heat dissipation becomes extremely vulnerable in cold environments. As human groups began expanding beyond Africa, that vulnerability could no longer be ignored. The first major migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa took place roughly between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago. These populations moved into the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Unlike equatorial Africa, these regions were shaped by strong seasonal variation and, during the Pleistocene, repeated glacial cycles. Cold winds, snow, freezing temperatures, and reduced daylight created conditions that exposed the limits of naked skin. At that point, covering the body stopped being optional. The challenge for modern science is that organic materials like hides, leather, and plant fibers rarely survive deep time. Unlike stone tools or bones, early clothing left almost no direct traces. Yet scientists have found indirect ways to reconstruct this critical moment in human history. One of the most unexpected sources of evidence comes from evolutionary biology, specifically from human lice. Humans host different types of lice, and one of them lives exclusively in clothing. Genetic studies comparing head lice and clothing lice show that these two lineages split from a common ancestor between approximately 170,000 and 100,000 years ago. That split could only have happened once clothing became a permanent feature of daily life. Clothing lice cannot survive without garments. Their existence depends entirely on fabric or hides worn consistently against the skin. This biological evidence provides one of the strongest timelines for the origin of regular clothing use. Archaeology supports this picture. Upper Paleolithic sites across Africa and Eurasia reveal tools associated with hide processing. Stone scrapers, cutting tools, and wear patterns indicate repeated contact with animal skins. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, occupied by Homo sapiens around 100,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered tools consistent with leather preparation. While these tools could serve multiple purposes, their frequency and wear suggest systematic skin processing. In Europe, the evidence becomes even clearer. Sites such as Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, dating to about 30,000 years ago, produced bone and ivory needles with extremely fine eye holes. These are not crude tools. They indicate careful stitching, tailored shapes and flexible garments made from hides or sinew. Sewing is a major leap forward. It transforms loose coverings into fitted clothing that traps heat and allows movement. Early clothing, however, was likely far simpler than what those needles represent. The first garments were probably animal skins, wrapped around the body or tied with plant fibers, vines, or leather strips. There was no standard shape, no decoration, and no fixed design. What mattered was insulation and protection. Learning how to turn a raw hide into something wearable required observation, experimentation, and shared knowledge. A fresh hide rots quickly, becomes stiff, attracts parasites, and smells strongly. Early humans had to discover ways to scrape fat, dry skins, soften them, and preserve them over time. This knowledge did not appear in isolation. It developed alongside other technological breakthroughs. Fire played a crucial role. Controlled use of fire is documented as early as 400,000 years ago at sites such as Gesher Benot Yaakov in present-day Israel. Fire extended daily activity into the night, offered protection from predators, and allowed cooking. But it also transformed clothing production. Heat helped dry hides, smoke reduced parasites, and warmth made leather more flexible and durable. Fire and clothing worked together, especially as humans pushed into colder latitudes. This combination was essential during extreme climatic phases, such as the last glacial maximum between roughly 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. Without both insulation and heat control, survival in those environments would have been nearly impossible. Clothing also had subtle biological consequences. By reducing direct exposure to cold, it lowered selective pressure on skin thickness and thermal tolerance. This allowed greater variation in body shape and physiology across populations. At the same time, clothing protected against intense ultraviolet radiation in high-exposure regions and conserved body heat in cold ones. These factors contributed indirectly to the global diversity of human skin pigmentation, a topic widely studied in biological anthropology. It is important to understand that clothing did not appear everywhere at once. This was not a single invention or a sudden revolution. It was a gradual process, shaped by geography and climate. Groups living in tropical environments continued using little or no clothing for tens of thousands of years, while populations in temperate and cold regions developed increasingly complex solutions. This variation persisted well into historical times and was documented by ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries. It shows that clothing is not an inevitable outcome of intelligence alone. It emerges when environment demands it. What we know about this early phase comes from multiple scientific fields working together. Paleoanthropology provides anatomical context. Archaeology offers tools and patterns of behavior. Genetics and molecular biology fill in gaps where material evidence disappears. No single discipline gives a full answer, but together they form a consistent picture. There is no exact date when humans first dressed themselves. Still, most evidence converges on a critical window between 170,000 and 100,000 years ago, when clothing became a stable and necessary part of human life. Before symbols, before ornamentation, before style, clothing was about survival. It was a quiet response from a species learning how to expand beyond its original limits, a way to face cold landscapes, new seasons, and unfamiliar worlds. In the next chapter, that practical solution begins to change. Slowly, clothing stops being just protection and starts carrying meaning. Technique turns into tradition. Function turns into culture. As clothing became a stable solution for survival, another transformation began to unfold. What started as protection against cold, wind, and exposure slowly turned into something more complex. Clothing began to carry meaning. This shift did not happen overnight, nor did it occur in the same way everywhere. It emerged gradually, alongside deeper cognitive abilities, growing social networks, and the rise of symbolic thinking. By roughly 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had developed fully modern cognitive capacities. This period, often called the Upper Paleolithic, is marked by a surge in symbolic behavior. Cave paintings, carved figurines, personal ornaments, and structured burial practices appear across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. These behaviors reveal something fundamental. The human body was no longer seen only as biological matter. It became a surface for expression. Clothing entered this symbolic world naturally. Early visual evidence suggests that garments had already become familiar enough to be represented in art. In caves such as Chauvet in France, dated to around 36,000 years ago, and Lascaux closer to 17,000 years ago, human figures appear stylized, sometimes with shapes that strongly suggest cloaks, wraps, or layered coverings. The images are abstract, but they imply that clothing was already integrated into how humans imagined themselves. At the same time, technology was advancing rapidly. Bone needles with drilled eyes found in regions like Siberia and Central Asia date back as far as 45,000 years. These tools required precision, planning, and fine motor control. Their presence signals tailored clothing rather than simple draping. Sewing allowed different skins to be joined, adjusted to the body, and repaired. This made garments warmer, longer lasting, and easier to move in. In extreme environments, these improvements were decisive. Archaeological sites such as Yana RHS, above the Arctic Circle, show that humans occupied harsh northern landscapes by at least 30,000 years ago. Survival there depended on carefully constructed clothing that trapped heat while allowing flexibility. In these conditions, clothing became as important as shelter or fire. Parallel to hide processing, another innovation quietly developed: the use of plant fibers. Although organic fibers decay quickly, indirect evidence reveals their early use. At the site of Zudzuana Cave in present-day Georgia, twisted and dyed flax fibers dated to around 34,000 years ago were discovered. Some fibers show signs of intentional coloring, indicating that they were not purely functional. This matters because it suggests a shift in priorities. Dyeing fibers requires extra effort and planning. It adds no thermal benefit. Its value lies elsewhere. Color introduces distinction, recognition, and possibly identity. Even at this early stage, clothing was beginning to move beyond survival. As human groups grew larger and more socially complex, clothing took on a communicative role. Subtle differences in how the body was covered could signal belonging, age, role, or experience. While direct evidence from prehistory is limited, comparative anthropology offers useful insight. Many historically documented hunter-gatherer societies used small variations in dress to convey social information, even when overall technology remained simple. These patterns suggest that symbolic clothing likely appeared long before agriculture or permanent settlements. Once garments became part of daily life, they naturally entered social language. A major turning point came with the Neolithic transition, beginning around 10,000 BCE in several regions of the world. The domestication of plants and animals reshaped nearly every aspect of human life, including clothing. Sedentary living allowed for storage, specialization, and the development of new materials. Animal domestication introduced fibers that did not require killing the animal. Sheep, first domesticated in the Near East, began to be bred for wool by around 4000 BCE. Wool offered insulation, durability, and flexibility unmatched by hides alone. Its production encouraged spinning, weaving, and large-scale textile manufacture. At the same time, plant fibers gained importance. Linen production flourished in ancient Egypt, where flax thrived along the Nile. By around 3500 BCE, Egyptian artisans were producing finely woven linen fabrics of remarkable quality. These textiles were not just practical, they were embedded in religious beliefs, ideas of purity, and social hierarchy. Clothing now clearly reflected social structure. Laborers wore simple garments. Priests used specific fabrics tied to ritual cleanliness. Elites wore lighter, finer textiles that required more labor to produce. The body became a visible marker of status. In Mesopotamia, visual records from around 3000 BCE show figures dressed in standardized wool garments, including skirts and draped cloaks. These images suggest shared cultural norms governing appearance. Clothing choices were no longer individual solutions. They followed collective expectations. Elsewhere, similar processes unfolded independently. In China, early silk production emerged by the 3rd millennium BCE. The domestication of silkworms and the mastery of silk weaving required advanced knowledge and long-term investment. Silk quickly became associated with prestige and authority. Its complexity made it valuable, and its use became regulated by social rank. As early states formed, clothing became tightly linked to economic systems. Textiles were traded, taxed, and stored. Written records from ancient civilizations include references to cloth as payment, tribute, and wealth. Laws began to address who could wear what, reinforcing social boundaries. At this stage, clothing was no longer just a reflection of culture. It actively shaped it. By controlling access to certain materials, colors, or styles, societies reinforced hierarchy and order. The body became a structured space, organized by rules that everyone understood. This transformation did not erase clothing's original function. Warmth and protection remained essential, but they were no longer the primary meaning. Clothing had become language. It conveyed information instantly, without speech, across distance and time. What emerges from archaeology, ancient art, textile analysis, and early written sources is a clear pattern. Once clothing stabilized as technology, it evolved into symbolism. Once it entered symbolism, it became inseparable from identity. By the end of the prehistoric period, humans were no longer just wearing garments to survive. They were wearing stories, roles, and values. The body had become a canvas shaped by tradition, environment, and belief. In the next chapter, this process reaches a new level. Clothing moves from cultural expression into systems of power, law, and control, shaping civilizations and defining social order on a global scale. As human societies grew more complex, clothing crossed a critical threshold. It stopped functioning mainly as protection or cultural expression and became a structured instrument of power. From this point forward, what people wore was no longer guided only by environment or tradition, but by rules, institutions, and economic systems. Clothing became embedded in social order. In the earliest urban civilizations, dress followed the rise of hierarchy. In ancient Egypt, beginning around 3000 BCE, linen dominated daily life, yet its quality, density, and finish varied sharply according to status. Fine, nearly transparent fabrics required skilled labor and time, making them accessible only to elites. Religious roles further shaped appearance. Priests wore specific garments associated with ritual purity, while rulers displayed authority through elaborate accessories and symbolic headdresses. Clothing operated as a visual code understood across the population. In ancient Greece, dress reflected philosophical and civic ideals. Between the 8th and 4th centuries BCE, garments such as the chiton and himation were constructed from simple rectangles of fabric, yet their draping conveyed discipline, balance, and restraint. These clothes emphasized the human form without excess structure. Despite their apparent simplicity, they reinforced sharp social distinctions. Citizens, foreigners, enslaved individuals, and women were visually differentiated through style, material, and context. Clothing communicated legal and social status before any words were exchanged. The Roman world intensified this logic. From the late Republic through the imperial period, clothing became explicitly regulated. The toga, worn only by free-born male citizens, symbolized political identity. Variations in color and border markings indicated rank or office. Purple dye, extracted from murex sea snails through a labor-intensive process, became one of the most powerful symbols of authority. Its use was progressively restricted by law. Sumptuary regulations defined who could wear specific fabrics, colors, or ornaments. Dress was no longer just tradition, it was legislation. Elsewhere, parallel systems developed independently. In imperial China, particularly during the Han and Tang dynasties, clothing was closely tied to state administration. Fabrics, colors, and decorative motifs were regulated according to rank. Silk remained central, but access to certain patterns or hues required imperial permission. Dress codes reinforced loyalty, hierarchy, and order, aligning the body with the structure of the state. During the European Middle Ages, clothing reflected both political fragmentation and religious authority. From roughly the 5th to the 15th century, textiles and styles varied widely by region, yet shared moral frameworks shaped appearance. Christian doctrine influenced ideas of modesty, humility, and excess. Bright colors, fine fabrics, and elaborate decoration were often restricted through sumptuary laws aimed at preserving class distinctions. These regulations were enforced in growing urban centers, where economic mobility threatened traditional hierarchies. As trade expanded across Europe, Asia, and the Islamic world, textiles became central to global exchange. Silk routes connected East Asia to the Mediterranean. Cotton cultivation spread through South Asia and the Middle East. Techniques, dyes, and patterns moved with merchants and artisans. Clothing began to reflect not only local identity, but global connection. Access to imported fabrics signaled wealth and influence. The Renaissance marked a turning point in how the body was shaped by clothing. Between the 15th and 16th centuries, advances in tailoring introduced fitted garments that altered posture and silhouette. Corsets, doublets, padded sleeves, and layered structures transformed clothing into architecture for the body. Portraiture from this period reveals how dress became a deliberate display of wealth, education, and cultural alignment. Clothing no longer adapted to the body adapted to clothing. This shift intensified with early modern states. As monarchies consolidated power, court fashion became a tool of control. Elaborate dress codes required nobles to invest heavily in appearance to maintain proximity to power. Clothing became expensive, restrictive, and symbolic. Participation in political life increasingly required visible conformity to elite standards. The Industrial Revolution disrupted this system in unprecedented ways. Beginning in the late 18th century, mechanized textile production transformed clothing from handcrafted goods into mass-produced commodities. Innovations such as the spinning jenny and power loom dramatically increased output while reducing cost. Cotton, sourced through global trade networks, replaced many traditional fibers. Clothing became accessible to wider populations. This expansion changed how dress functioned socially. When garments became cheaper and more abundant, traditional markers of class lost some clarity. New forms of distinction emerged, based not on access to materials, but on speed of change, taste, and novelty. Fashion became cyclical. Styles shifted rapidly, driven by urban centers and commercial markets. By the 19th century, fashion had evolved into a system. Paris emerged as a global reference point. The rise of haute couture formalized seasonal collections and authorship in design. Clothing gained association with creativity and innovation, not just utility or status. At the same time, industrial labor produced standardized garments that shaped daily life for millions. The 20th century accelerated these trends. Global conflicts, technological innovation, and social movements reshaped clothing's role. Uniforms became symbols of nation and ideology. Women's clothing changed alongside shifts in labor, rights, and social expectations. Practical garments once associated with work, such as trousers, jackets, and denim, entered everyday life across social groups. Mass media amplified these changes. Film, photography, and advertising spread styles across borders at unprecedented speed. Clothing became a platform for personal expression, political identity, and cultural affiliation. Subcultures used dress to challenge norms. Youth movements transformed appearance into statement. Despite this apparent freedom, clothing remained embedded in power structures. Production relied on global supply chains, labor inequalities, and resource extraction. Brands shaped desire. Economic access continued to influence choice. Even in contemporary societies, dress codes operate in schools, workplaces, and institutions, regulating bodies in subtle ways. Scientific and historical research reveals a consistent pattern. Clothing has always communicated meaning. What changed over time was the scale and complexity of that communication. From survival tool to cultural symbol to economic commodity, clothing evolved alongside human society itself. Today, clothing operates at multiple levels simultaneously. It protects, expresses, signals belonging, and reflects global systems of production and consumption. The same garment can represent comfort, identity, labor, and environmental impact all at once. Understanding when humans began wearing clothes is only the starting point. The deeper story lies in how clothing reshaped relationships between individuals and societies, between bodies and power. Covering the body was never a neutral act. It was a step toward organizing the world. From animal skins wrapped against the cold to garments produced on a global scale, clothing has remained a constant companion in human history. It records adaptation, creativity, inequality, and meaning. It reflects who we are, how we live, and how we define ourselves. In this long trajectory, clothing stands as one of humanity's most enduring technologies, not because of the materials used, but because of the ideas it carries. If this journey changed the way you see clothing, like, share, and subscribe to keep exploring human history through science and evidence.